There was, however, one piece of good news on this front today. Israel announced that it had rescued Army Private Ori Magidish, who was captured on October 7th, along with several others. 12 of her fellow soldiers at her post were killed. Israel says that still leaves nearly 240 hostages held in Gaza. Meanwhile, hanging over all of this are a lot of uncomfortable questions about the Israeli government itself and its leader, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Those questions are laid out in a deeply reported piece by New York Times reporters Ronen Bergman, Mark Mazzetti, and Maria Abi Habib, titled "How Years of Israeli Failures on Hamas Led to a Devastating Attack." The most powerful military force in the Middle East had not only completely underestimated the magnitude of the attack, it had totally failed in its intelligence gathering efforts, mostly due to hubris and the mistaken assumption that Hamas was a threat contained. Overall, arrogance among Israeli political and security officials convinced them that the country's military and technological superiority to Hamas would keep the terrorist group in check. And even now, 3 weeks into this war, it is not clear that Israel's leader has figured out how to talk to his country about how and why Israel's vaunted sense of invincibility has been so suddenly shattered. Many senior officials have accepted responsibility, but Mr. Netanyahu has not. At 1 a.m. Sunday in Israel, after his office was asked for comment on this article, he posted a message on X, formerly Twitter, that repeated remarks he made to the New York Times, and blamed the military and intelligence services for failing to provide him with any warning on Hamas. The blowback to the prime minister's blame shifting was so swift and so overwhelming that he deleted that post and subsequently apologized, something basically unheard of for the hard-charging prime minister. Joining me now is Mark Mazzetti, a Washington investigative correspondent for the New York Times. Mark, thank you for being here. I found this account deeply distressing, but also riveting. It sounds like there was a cascade of failures that led to October 7th, and I'm sure you have thoughts on which was the most sizable. But one of the ones that stuck out to me was the idea that the Israeli Defense Forces stopped monitoring Hamas radio traffic, and that at the outset of this attack, nobody thought it was serious enough to wake the prime minister. Can you talk a little bit about the decisions that led to the stoppage, effectively, of monitoring important methods of communications for this attack in particular?
Sure. So what we found is that this is not just a matter of if there was one warning they could have heeded in the weeks or days before the attack, maybe it could have been headed off. In fact, it was a series of bad decisions over the years that basically came down to the conclusion that Hamas was not capable of attacking Israel, that Hamas was not interested in attacking Israel, and therefore the Israeli security resources should be devoted elsewhere. They should be devoted toward particularly Iran, Hezbollah, the powerful Iranian proxy force, but Hamas was not considered a serious threat. So when you bring up the fact that they were not listening to radio traffic, that was just one example of, well, this was, radio communication of low-level Hamas fighters. What's the purpose? What good would it do them, they thought, to monitor this traffic? Again, this belief was that Hamas was deterred and Hamas was not interested in attacking. So it was all sort of this mosaic of bad decision-making that led to the attacks on October 7th.
And it sounds like Israel disregarded the good intelligence they did have. I mean, the warnings that were issued forth internally or even externally from countries like Jordan effectively went ignored. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. The Jordanians were warning, and even Israeli generals for months were going to political leaders and making a broader point. They were saying that the political agenda that Benjamin Netanyahu was pursuing, which was this what they call judicial reform, was in fact seizing power from the judiciary, which was creating mass protests in Israel. The assessment of the intelligence community was that this was weakening the country and emboldening Israel's enemies. So they were warning warning that there might be an attack coming, and Mr. Netanyahu ignored it. In fact, in our story, we point out that he refused to even meet a senior general in July who wanted to deliver that warning. But the generals themselves didn't quite get the exact attack right. They thought something was coming, but they didn't think it was going to be from Hamas, from Gaza. So it really was a case where there was blame all around for not really understanding the big picture.
And then there is the sort of role that Hamas was playing in Netanyahu's broader struggles with the Palestinian Authority. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and how it factored into this attack?
Sure. Well, so Netanyahu has for years talked tough about Hamas, about how they're going to wipe out Hamas. And remember, Hamas has been effectively governing the Gaza Strip for more than a decade. And in that vein, actually, the Netanyahu government over the years, in fact, pursued a policy of propping up Hamas, sort of counterbalancing the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank with money to Hamas. The strategy was, in effect, to kind of divide and conquer. If you prop up Hamas, it weakens the Palestinian Authority, and it gave Netanyahu this sort of case to say, listen, I have no credible partners here. And so, therefore, they sort of slow-rolled the peace process. So that is now pretty well documented that, despite the rhetoric, Netanyahu over the years and ministers in Israel, in effect, empowered Hamas with giving them a lot of money. And so that's sort of part of the picture as well.
I think you're right to call it a sort of mosaic of failures because the errors were omnidirectional, it sounds like, Mark. How has Netanyahu managed the moment and effectively communicating with the Israeli public about this cascade of failures? I mean, we mentioned that he deleted that tweet that absolved himself of any failures. How is he dealing with it now? What does the domestic political landscape look like for him in the context of these attacks?
Well, it was quite strange over the weekend when we were finishing up the story. We put questions to his office, the Prime Minister's office, about what we were going to report. He responded with that response that he then tweeted out. And then the next day, it created this controversy, this really firestorm of people saying he was passing the buck. He deleted the tweet, but we still had his statement. And that was sort of showing that he was not ready to accept blame. Several senior Israeli intelligence officials, military officials and others have said effectively, you know, we were to blame. We will resign when this is over, but we're going to fight this war first. Netanyahu hadn't done that. So what we saw today with the press conference was a little bit of in essence, a move at damage control. But you know, clearly Netanyahu is fighting for his political life as a result of this.
Mark Mazzetti, it's a really, really, really important story, especially right now. Thank you for joining me tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.